What is that for? Okay.
Thank you, Brad.
Awesome.
No problem. All right, Chris. What would be your definition for ethics?
Adherence to, are we talking about, well, I guess Christian ethics, that would be the ultimate standard. Adherence to the example of Jesus Christ and the commandments of God the Father.
Okay. In the book, hopefully most of you guys have got a Christian ethics book by Geisler. If you don't, let me encourage you strongly to get a copy of it. In the book, in the very first chapter, he starts out by outlining some opposing views to Christian ethics. What are some other ethical guidelines out there? What are some other ethical views out there? I want us to somewhat quickly look at what he presents, just so you guys are very familiar with it. First one he gives is might is right. In other words, the idea that justice is in the interest of the strongest party. Somebody tell me give me a problem with this. What's wrong with this as being our standard for ethics?
Well, because it's talking about the majority rules. And that's not right. At the time of the New Testament, the Romans were the majority, but obviously they were way off, as an example.
Absolutely. All right. First problem. Fails to note the difference between power and goodness. So just because you've got a strong power in control, or a lot of people, that doesn't necessarily make something good. Can anybody think of an example of that?
An example of the failure to know the differences between power and goodness?
Yeah.
Holocaust.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. Very good. I put on here number 2, you've got tyrants like Nero and Stalin as another example of the problems with it, because they had loads and loads of might. I mean, talk about military powers, they were superpowers, and yet nobody, looking back in hindsight, would call what they were doing good. So just because you've got a lot of might, that does not mean that it's right. The second one is morals are mores. In other words, what is morally right is determined by the group to which it belongs. So, for instance, if in the United States we decide that eating our firstborn child is a good thing, because the group has decided that, then that's determined as being right. What's the problem there?
The group is usually wrong.
Groups, yeah, mobs are usually wrong.
Okay? Just because people are doing something doesn't mean they ought to. That's the is-ought problem. Look at the second problem I put up on the screen. What happens if you have communities that have different morals? So let's say, for instance, that the United States of America really does pass a law where you have to eat your firstborn. Well, what happens to our relation with Canada and Mexico if one of their people comes to the United States and they don't want to kill their firstborn? All of a sudden, because it's a community only, you're going to have a lot of question as to, okay, what happens with all the other people on the planet? You've got 6 billion other people who don't view that as being right. So what happens when these communities collide or clash? That's the second one. Third one. Man is the measure of all things. Protagoras, the Greek philosopher, basically phrased it that exact way. Man is the measure of all things. Therefore, this would indicate each individual's own will is a standard for what is right and wrong. Now, hopefully you guys can see the problem in this one. What's wrong with saying that man is the measure of all things?
Fall short of Christ. Fall short of God.
And he's
Okay.
inconstant.
It's inconstant. It falls short of God. It's invariable. What about this? It's going to imply that some acts are right even if it's cruel or hateful to others, because after all, if I think it's good for me, it may be bad for you. If every single individual got to determine what was right in their eyes. So for instance, I've used this example a lot in speaking. If there's a job that is to test hammocks that pays $500,000, and Dean Meadows and I are both going for that job, and I know that he's got an interview at 1 o'clock on Wednesday, and I've got an interview at 1:30, and I know he's a much better at laying in hammocks than I am, so I'm worried about getting the job. So about 12 o'clock, I go and slash all 4 of his tires. He misses the interview, I get the job. What's the problem?
Well, since it's deep.
Because in my eyes, that would be okay.
There's no standard for authority.
No standard. Actually, your standard would be what was right in each individual's eyes. Ultimately, you'll notice I put here, ultimately it would destroy the community. And that's absolutely correct, because you cannot have a divided house like that all over society. Because I might think it's right for me to kill the armored truck guy, because after all, my family's hungry, or we didn't get to go to Disney World this month. All right. Next. Human race is the basis of right. In other words, rather than looking at a specific community or an individual, this one tries to use the entire human race as a whole for the standard for good. So we've got one view that says, okay, we're going to look at the community. We say, no, that's not good because communities sometimes clash. We got one that says we're going to look at the individual, and we all look at that and say, no, that's no good because individuals can come up with some crazy things. So maybe we look at the entire human race. What's the problem with that?
The human race is made up of individuals and different communities, so there's no real standard.
Absolutely, there's no standard. What else? Would you guys say that the human race changes?
Yeah, absolutely.
For instance, did your grandparents even know what a stem cell was? The answer is no. Did your great-grandparents have any clue of what in vitro fertilization was? The answer is no. So how can they have a basis for what is right and wrong in these areas if it wasn't even around? Number one, the whole race in the community would be wrong, could be wrong. For instance, you got an example like Jonestown where Jim Jones led 913 people to their death for doing something he thought was right. And then second, the human race is changing as are ethical practices. The next one that Geisler gives is right as moderation. Aristotle believed morality was found in moderation. Therefore, people were to take the moderate course of action. In other words, don't be in the left ditch, don't be in the right ditch. You stay right in the middle of the road, and you're going to be okay. Everything will be just fine as long as you are right down the middle. What's the problem with that one?
Sitting on the fence, it's not picking a side.
That's true. Very true.
So evil, then even in the middle is evil.
Excellent point.
Well, even society can't define what moderation is. So
There you go. There you go. While moderation is often good, is it a measure of morality? Oftentimes the right thing is the extreme thing, especially today. Second, as a part to that, who gets to determine what is moderate? What might be moderate to you guys may seem insane, liberal, crazy, wild to me. So if this is our approach to ethics, guys, understand that we've got a problem, because ultimately what I consider to be moderate, you may consider to be conservative or liberal. The next one that I'm going to show you, I think, is probably where most of our society is right now. When we talk about ethics, we talk about, hey, we got to have some kind of standard. Their standard is what brings pleasure. This comes from the Epicureans. The hedonists claim that if it feels good, do it. Anything painful, therefore, automatically would be wrong. Again, let me ask the question, what's wrong with this one?
Your pleasure can come at the expense of others, and that's obviously very wrong.
Okay. Pleasure could come at the expense of others. Is all pleasure good?
Nope.
No.
Can somebody give me an example?
Well, to the murderer, the spree killer or whatever, murdering people is fun. Murdering people
Absolutely.
brings them pleasure, but clearly
And to a psychopath, it does bring them pleasure. That is a fun thing for them.
so it goes back to that shifting standard again. There's nothing constant. There's nothing universal.
There's also repercussions to what may feel good now. So it may bring pleasure now, but it'll hurt later. So that makes it not right.
Absolutely. That is number 3 on the screen in front of you guys. Are we dealing with immediate pleasure or pleasure in the future? Because, guys, if you think about it for just a moment, in a really twisted way, Christians do somewhat follow this in that we are looking for eternal pleasure. We're wanting pleasure when the day of judgment comes. Of course, we don't base our ethical opinions on this principle, but the point is, we are doing certain things because we're looking for a payoff later on in the future. So, is it immediate pleasure or is it pleasure in the future?
Brad, what does number 3 say?
Number 3 says immediate pleasure or pleasure in the future. Number 2 says what kind of pleasure, that there's a missing O there, what kind of pleasure should be used as the test. And then number 1, not all pleasures are good, for instance, sadism, and not all pain is bad.
And most people today are often people of instant gratification also, which plays
Absolutely.
a role in this. Do I want
Absolutely.
to feel good today, or can I wait for it?
Next one, right is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Okay, so we've got the community view, we've got the individual view, we've got the whole human race view. We've already kind of poked holes in those as being problematic. And so then you've got these philosophers that come along and they say, okay, maybe it's not for the individual. Maybe our ethics should not be for a community, for the human race, but maybe ethics should be based on what is right for the greatest good of the greatest number of people. Problem with that?
You're still leaving some people out.
Okay, you're leaving some people out.
I mean, it's a hybrid of the same weaknesses as you find in right is what brings pleasure, and the human race is the basis of right.
Absolutely. And again, guys, think about it for just a moment. How do you define good? As you're sitting there taking notes or thinking about it, it seems pretty simple. You're sitting there thinking, well, good is good. But if I'm teaching this class to a group of atheists or a group of Muslims or a group of whatever, Hindus, we may be viewing good as different things. Or if I'm teaching the class to a group of homosexuals, they may view good as something different. So how do we ultimately define what is good? Number two, does what is moral bring the greatest good? Number three, this principle relies on people knowing the future. In other words, you're making ethical standards with the assumption that you know, hey, this is going to be good for people in the long run.
Hey, Brad,
Yes, sir.
can you explain number 2? Because it seems like what you're saying is that not all moral things bring good.
Number two should say, does what is moral bring the greatest good, or does what is morally right bring the greatest good? Does that make more sense?
Yep.
All right. And again, guys, all of these are in the opening chapter of Geisler's book. Next view that he gives is right is what is desirable for its own sake. That is, that which is desirable for its own sake in and of itself. So again, we look at problems. We say, how do we define what is morally good act? This one is easy to confuse what is desired versus what is desirable. The next one, I've actually had some folks, some atheists, try to argue with me about. They say right is indefinable. That there's no standard. That good, you can't define good. That there's nothing. But guys, think with me, what's the problem on that one?
We define it. Most cultures throughout the world have basic rights and wrongs that they follow.
Wouldn't that support?
Okay, what else? If you can't define good, what else can you not define?
Evil.
You can't define bad. Just because we don't define something, does that mean it doesn't exist? You know, just because we as an, if we were a group of atheists, just because we as a group of atheists say, okay, you really can't define good, does that mean the concept, the idea of good does not exist? And the answer is no. Guys, just because we don't recognize something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Okay, those are all opposing views to what we're going to be discussing in this class, and that is that good is what God wills. This is a Christian ethics class. And as such, all of these topics that we look at, we're going to be looking at it through the perspective, through the lenses, that whatever God does, approves, or says is ultimately what is good. Conversely, what actions he specifies to be evil is, by definition, evil. Therefore, by this definition, guys, you need to understand this, by this definition, good can be ultimate, meaning there is absolutes, and you can actually specify what is good and what's bad. Now, having said that, let me get a volunteer. Let's see. Oh, how about Dan?
Okay.
Dan, tell me why. Okay, first off, let's go down this path. Should schools be teaching kids ethical values, right and wrong, integrity, honesty, etc.?
No, they should be getting that probably from their house.
Okay, I would agree with that. But
I
for
know a lot of my friends homeschool because they think they're being taught the wrong thing at school. Because
okay, but for the 45% of those people in public schools who don't get any training at home at all about ethics, do you think schools should at least mention it,
Oh, yeah.
or touch on it, or teach
Yeah.
it?
Yep.
Okay? All right. I agree with you. Michael Smith,
Yes.
tell me how a teacher can teach ethics in the school system.
Well, through discipline, based upon if the student acts up, if they're not agreeing with what's going on in class, not obeying the rules of the class.
Hey, wait. Stop right there.
Okay.
What would be that teacher's standard for what is good and bad behavior?
Well, I'm sure the teacher would lay it out at the beginning of the course as to you can't do this, you can't do that, you have to be on time for class, you can't cheat.
Okay, but why does that teacher get to do that? Why can't the students do that?
Because the teacher is responsible for the student. They're a higher
Who says the teacher? Okay, so because that person is a higher authority, she gets to make the rules. What if the teacher wants to molest those children?
Then it's a violation of a higher authority than her. And someone has to bring that to their attention in order for that to be taken care of.
Okay, what if the principal's in on it and he doesn't have a problem with it?
Time to go to mom and dad to go to the law.
Superintendent.
Okay, guys, here's what I'm getting at, and here's what I think a lot of people are missing today. And that is, we have an educational system that is trying to teach, somewhat trying to still ordain ethics, morality, honesty, these kinds of things, but they're not allowing God in the classroom. How do you teach ethics without a standard for ethics? You know, the reason I was asking,
Yeah.
go ahead.
My mother's been teaching for fifth grade for 45 years. And she has a way of doing it without putting God into it. How she does that is from her experience with students, and it's through discipline. I don't know.
But do you understand what I'm saying? If you're trying to teach a child, hey, you shouldn't lie, and the child says, why not? Well, are we gonna say because the mighty people said so, or because the community said so, or because the individual said so, or because it's good for the greatest good of the people? You see, if you don't have an ultimate standard, which is, we use God, obviously, as being your ultimate right and wrong, they're forced to try to teach ethics from one of these opposing views that we just looked at. And guys, that is the flimsiest ground you can be on. Basically, a teacher who is trying to instill an ethical, moral purpose in folks is left by saying, well, because it's going to hurt somebody else. Well, a kid may sit there and think, if I don't do this, it's going to hurt me. Or, so what if it hurts somebody? I don't care. Point is, if we remove God from a classroom, how in the world can you have any kind of standard in that classroom when it comes to ethics? The answer is deep down you really can't, because there's nothing absolute. There's not a unchanging standard. Questions, comments, thoughts? All right. What is it based on? Christian ethics based on God's will. It is absolute. It is based on God's revelation. It is prescriptive. And it's deontological. We are going to look a little bit more at some of those, but the point I hope you do not miss is this. If you don't have God's unchanging nature as the foundation for ethics, then ultimately you're going to find yourself right back in one of those opposing views we just talked about, and every single one of those had problems. Now, aside from just all-out atheism, what do you guys think is some of society's problem with using God as our standard?
Can you put that back up there, please?
Absolutely. What do you think is some folks' standard or problem with us using God as a standard?
They don't want to do what God wants them to do.
Okay. What else?
It defines a moral right and wrong, and it causes them to be held accountable on either side of that.
There are a lot of folks who do not want to put all of the authority in one central figure. God being that figure. These are folks who would like to spread the wealth, so to speak, in that they want to spread the idea of what is right and wrong among lots of different individuals or powers or whatever you want to say. They don't like one person being responsible for everything. Ultimately, they also don't like the fact that you're not consulting them personally about what is right and wrong.
I got it, brother. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go on and put the next slide up because it's rather wordy. You guys know that most of the time I don't have this many words, but for those of you who have your textbooks, you're going to notice like the next 6 chapters deals with each one of these views on ethics. Antinomianism, situationism, generalism, unqualified absolutism, conflicting absolutism, and graded absolutism. Geisler spends an entire chapter for each one of these. We're not going to spend that long because we don't have that much time in class. I do expect you guys to at least be familiar with what these are. Antinomianism says that there are no moral laws. Basically, that you can't say what's right and wrong. Situationism affirms there's one absolute law. Generalism claims that there are some general laws but no absolute laws. So, everything's this beautiful shade of gray. Unqualified absolutism believes in many absolute norms that never conflict. Conflicting absolutism contends that there are many absolute norms that sometimes conflict, and we're obligated to do the lesser evil. Graded absolutism holds that many absolute laws sometimes conflict, and we are responsible. I say all that to say this. Guys, be very familiar with what these are. Be able to at least give me a decent description of each one of these 6 views on ethics. But aside from that, after you've got a pretty good grasp on them, you're going to be able to skip a pretty good chunk in your book.
Hey, Brad, one question.
Yes, sir.
Okay, this country was originally founded on the belief that there is one God. And from that, in the beginning, there were some sort of Christian ethics which have been passed down over the last 200-something years to some degree to the majority of the people in this country. So based on that, we have a foundation for ethics, don't we, in this country? Now, in Iran, their ethics are a little different because they base it on Islam and jihad and all these other things. And
Okay, wait a second. Michael, think about this. Does history and precedent make it right?
no.
Okay. Because China has a long history of certain ethics. And like you said, Iran has a certain history on ethics. We have a long history and ethics. And we think ours is right. We think our founding fathers were God-fearing, Bible-believing people. But just because we have a history and we have precedent, that doesn't make it morally right. So I can't go back and look at our founding fathers and say, hey, everything they prescribed is right, because you got to remember, our founding fathers, many of them actually, whether we like to talk about it or not, a lot of them did have slaves. And so you got all kind of little situations that you got to think about before you can just lay down and say, okay, these, surely this is right. Surely what we're building this on is right.
Yeah, but like stealing or lying or cheating or things like that are basic ethics that are
Great question. All right. Where did our founding fathers get those from?
Ten Commandments.
Now, actually, not really. We got to take one step before we get to the
Probably
Ten
from the
Commandments.
Catholic Church in England.
They got them from the Parliament from England, maybe a little bit in from the church. You guys got to remember that most of Europe's judicial system was set up based on using what? Now you can go to the Ten Commandments. So you got Europe as a whole, primarily the parliaments, the judicial systems, that are adopting the Ten Commandments as right and wrong. We got colony guys who come over here and they realize, hey, a lot of what we had in our judicial system was right. Let's adopt most of that. So they copy many of the European rules and regulations that were ultimately copied from the Bible.
So why didn't they just stick with the Ten Commandments?
They don't like that.
Yeah.
Because we're witches.
I would say, well, they may have had something to do with it. The Christian Crusades may have left a little bit of a bad taste in their mouth. But if you look at our founding documents and the founding laws, we'll get into some of that during this class. Guys, some of it's word for word straight out of the Bible. I mean, they really did pay close attention to what God was saying. For instance, when we talk about sexual ethics, and you go back and you look at what did Virginia or what did Maryland, what did they prescribe to somebody who committed these certain abominations? Guys, a lot of their punishments were pretty much straight out of the Bible. Okay, questions, comments, thoughts before we start down the abortion track.
Can you put that slide of the 6 views of ethics back on for one more second?
Absolutely.
Or 25 seconds.
Now, I'll point out to you guys too, again, most of I'll upload these, PowerPoints to my iDisk, either later today, during our break, or sometime. So you guys will have a copy of them. Okay, so we've already established fact in this class, we are going to use God as our standard. This is Christian ethics. Now, that isn't to say that we're not going to run into some situations and some deals that we're going to have to iron out and figure out exactly what God would have us do. But I need you to understand right up front, if you tell me, well, that's what makes most people feel good, or that's what the mighty people would want us to do, or that's what individuals should do, I'm basically going to look at you and laugh, because ultimately what we should do is whatever God's will is. Geisler in chapter 8, he starts out dealing with abortion. Somebody give me the history of abortion in the United States of America.
You talking about legal abortion or illegal abortion?
Yeah.
Legal abortion began as a federal thing in 1973, I believe, wasn't it?
Okay.
Roe versus Wade?
Yes.
The Supreme Court took in deciding that case, took the right of the states to decide that issue for themselves away and made it a federal thing. So abortion was legal in all 50 states.
Okay, so there's a sitting Supreme Court in 1973. Made the infamous Roe versus Wade case. And in fact, that is Mrs. Roe, so to speak. Her real name is actually Norma McCorvey. Do any of you have any idea what her role was in the whole thing? I take that as a no. Okay. Norma McCorvey, I'm gonna X out of the slide. Norma McCorvey was a pawn, and in fact, she learns about the Roe versus Wade decision just like we did, and that is when it came out on TV. When we did an interview with her, and she shared with us the fact that she was pregnant, she didn't think she wanted to have the child, and there were some attorneys who had talked to her and said, hey, if you come up to our apartment, we will tell you what options are available to you. She goes up to their apartment, they buy her free pizza and beer, and literally all they wanted and all they got from her was her signature on a court case. Norma McCorvey, Mrs. Jane Roe, never got an abortion, ever. She actually had her child, that particular child she gave up for adoption. But long story short, these attorneys had already made their mind, hey, we're going to try to fight this abortion thing. We need somebody who can kind of be our figurehead, our guinea pig. They highlighted her. They feed her free beer and pizza. She signs a form that says, yeah, I want to sue for the right to get rid of my child. She forgets about it. Literally dozens of months later, she finds out through the media that, hey, this thing has now become legalized. How many abortions are we having a year?
Like 40 million?
40 million? I'm talking about just in the United States now. We're not talking China.
25,000.
4,500 a day, roughly, which we'll talk about in a minute. But long story short, we're killing somewhere in the neighborhood, depending on the year, anywhere between 1.2 and 1.5 million a day. There is a memorial that you guys, if you ever get a chance to see it, I would strongly encourage you. It is pretty powerful. It is in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And it is something as preachers that you need to be aware of, if for no other reason than just to share with your members so that they know what's going on out there. That memorial, when you go inside, you'll notice all these little plaques on the wall. And you'll see teddy bears, you see the flowers, you see the little Bibles, the notes, all these kinds of things. I'll zoom in just so you can see one stretch of the... that is one stretch of plaques. What I want you to notice is you've got somebody who in 79 through 81 had 5 abortions. One of the letters that was there in that particular memorial said, Baby Tara, today I honor you as my unborn child, now in eternity with the Lord. You would have been 25 years old today. My heart weeps for you. You're in my heart and on my mind always. You would have 3 other siblings had you lived. My life was filled with sorrow, shame, and regrets until I sought help. I feel now that I'm forgiven by God and myself. I have a lot of healing to go. It makes me feel better knowing that someday I'll be able to hold you in heaven. Very, 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 very powerful place, guys. Now, to put in perspective the ethical situation that we're talking about here, somebody tell me, what is the true argument? What is it that folks are wanting?
The right to choose.
Okay? The right to choose.
Escape from consequences.
So a lady comes up to you in your congregation and she says, I'm 42, we thought we were done, I just can't do this, it's my body, it's my right.
Selfishness.
Are you asking what we would tell that woman?
Sure.
I'd give her the number to Colorado Christian Services. Because
Okay.
adoption, it's her body and her right to choose her life, that baby has a body that belongs to that baby, and has.
Okay, Chris. Chris, let me bring it home to you for just a minute. Let me give you a real answer that I actually heard out of the lips of a young person.
Okay.
Who said, and I quote, "I don't want stretch marks, and I don't want to have to go through all that in my body."
You should have thought about that before you get yourself into the situation.
Okay?
And that your cosmetic issues are not worth the life of an innocent child.
Oh, I totally agree with you. I'm just saying that if you politely hand somebody an adoption card, believe it or not, you got people out there who are mentally thinking, 9 months, I got to go through morning sickness, I got to go through body changes, I got to go through people staring at me and I may not be married, and I got to go through all of this stuff. It seems like it'd be easier if I just went with door number 2. So the answer, is not just handing them over to an adoption agency.
Well, I mean, I would talk to him first. I wouldn't just, have a stack of those cards and just hand them out. I would,
I've had a friend tell
Okay.
I have a friend back home. She told me that women have a risk of dying having a baby, and she didn't want to risk her own life with that. That's why she had the abortion. I don't know if that's. I can't say it's valid, but.
We'll talk about that in just a minute. I won't say that's garbage, but anyway. If she'd have said that 300 years ago, I might have been a little bit more compassionate, but as of today, I'm not very compassionate on that. What else? Let me share with you their true position, guys, because I think a lot of times in Christianity we miss this. We think of the abortion industry as kind of a mean, Darth Vader kind of persona, when the way that they are attracting women is they are actually attracting women saying that we're protecting women. You go to places like Planned Parenthood or some of these clinics, and they say, hey, if we don't do this, women are going to die in the alleys and in the gutters by these crackpot abortion clinics that are done in the back alleys. And so what we're doing is we're saving lives. We are preventing the unnecessary death of loads and loads of women. And guys, unfortunately, that sells people. People buy into that garbage. Do what now?
It's exploitative, though.
Absolutely. Because who have they left out of the equation?
That'd be like the U.S. government saying we're going to sell you marijuana, or I guess like cocaine or something, to know that we made that correctly, so you don't have to die if it was made incorrectly.
Exactly. Yeah. All right, let's put this in perspective for just a moment so that you guys can actually, when you speak to people, you can talk to them on a very, very educational kind of perspective. On the screen right now, and most of you have probably seen this, you got at the top the Civil War, the war in which the most people ever died in. 498,000 folks, each cross representing 50,000 casualties. You got World War I, 116,000. You got World War II, 407,000. Anybody know the latest statistics on the Iraq War?
4,000.
Okay. To put that in perspective, you wouldn't get a cross. The Iraqi war would not even get a whole cross yet. Now, the war on the unborn would look something like this. That was up to date roughly 7 or 8 years ago. It's actually increased by now, obviously. So hopefully that kind of puts in perspective the enormity of this thing.
Brad, what exactly are these stats now? These are numbers of what? People that have died?
American War Dead.
Yes.
American War Dead?
Yeah, Civil War.
Vietnam War, we lost roughly 58,000 people. So that would be represented by one cross representing 50,000 casualties. All right. I realize this one's kind of graphic, but that's okay.
So Brad,
54,000 every 24 hours, guys. Now, as you look at those pictures, I need you to understand from a medical perspective, and I'm going to take it off so you don't have to look at it forever and ever. From a medical perspective, a clinician cannot perform an abortion without physically reassembling that child. And by that I mean when a woman goes in for an abortion procedure, there's a suction canister. That canister is actually taken to a back room where they have to literally piecemeal, put everything back together to make sure they did not leave any parts in that lady that can then either become infected, can set up sepsis, or whatever. And so while we a lot of times kind of think of this in a sterile, just a vacuuming out process, it couldn't be further from the truth. It is a very, very messy situation. Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 25. Somebody read that for me. Deuteronomy 27, 25.
Cursed is he who accepts a bribe to strike down an innocent person, and all the people shall say, Amen.
Okay. I'm going to give you a way to remember abortion anytime you are preaching, anytime you're speaking to folks, to hopefully kind of land the plane for them. I just mentioned to you guys that we're killing somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,500 every day. I also told you that we lost 58,000 people in the Vietnam War. That war lasted us 11 years. Cost 58,000 of our best young men and women. The point is this, guys. We're killing more unborn children in America. We're not talking about China. In America, in any given 11 days than we did in 11 years in Vietnam. That ought to put it in perspective to you. So here's the situation. The fight is allegedly either about life or about choice. So we ask the question, we say, all right, what is life? I mean, how would we define life? Hopefully you guys have all seen the picture that's on the screen right now. This was a child, that's actually a womb that the doctor is holding that has been lifted out of the mother. And they were doing spina bifida surgery in a child that was 21 weeks old, Samuel Alexander. And when they were closing up this surgery, the child actually reached out his hand. He grips the finger of the surgeon. The point being, guys, that's not just dead tissue. 21 weeks is a very common stage for abortion procedures, as you'll hear later on today. But the point being, a child that reaches out and purposefully grabs a finger like that, you can't look at that and tell me that's just dead tissue. In fact, we know 34% of babies born at 5.5 months survive. So, given that statistic, somebody tell me, how do we as fathers and as preachers effectively combat this problem? John?
You teach that life begins from conception. That God breathed into life, into all of us from the point of that conception, and that it is precious from that point.
Okay. Somebody, well, everybody tell me what is going to be the response back to John from an abortionist standpoint. What are they going to argue? What is their one thing they like to throw out?
Well, a lot of them could say they don't believe in God. That could be a big one that'll shoot that down right away.
Maybe. What is the one? Do what?
They say that we're preachers and we're men and we can't understand and we're not sympathetic to women.
They say life doesn't begin.
Okay. Okay. A lot of folks would say life doesn't start at conception. So the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to define life. What do they also say about mommy? How many of you in there have heard the argument that, well, what about if the mom is going to die? Anybody heard that?
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Okay. What is your response to that? John, you present an elegant case. You say, look, life begins at conception. And they look at you and they say, yeah, but you got this mom who may die if they don't take the baby out. Because that is kind of like their ace in the hole, so to speak.
Sure.
Dean, have you got a comment?
Oh,
Or are you just scratching?
I was just going to say that I think another part of it is you've got to teach the value of life from God's Word as well. I mean,
Okay.
be consistent.
And I think that's where John was going. I think he was basically showing and developing the idea that, look, we got to start from conception, and we got to talk about being made in the image and likeness of God. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I know it's a complete emotional argument and situation. I mean, you could show some raw data, details, statistics about how it's a greater risk for a woman to step outside her front door. She's at greater risk of dying by just getting in her car and driving down to the convenience store than she is through a full-term pregnancy, and that that you can't go that route if you had to, but I know the abortion industry, like you said, like you covered, they're all about protecting women, or they they use that facade that they're all about protecting women and protecting them from losing their life or what have you, but the statistics, the data shows they are not at a great risk. You are
Okay.
at risk just to...
First thing you need to remember when you're talking to somebody and they try to play that card is ask them very honestly, very sincerely, very lovingly, has medical technology changed in the last 15 to 20 years? The obvious answer is what?
Yes.
Absolutely. Guys, and I know Andrea and Anthony probably know this firsthand, we now have 4D technology when it comes to sonograms, ultrasounds. You can actually see eyelashes today. So in cases where you're talking about something going wrong in the womb, do we have the ability to detect, diagnose, and treat a whole lot earlier and a whole lot better than we did in the past?
Yes.
Absolutely. Also, you add to that, within the past 15 years, have we added in utero surgery as one of the techniques that we can now do? And the answer is yes. They actually do almost all spina bifida surgeries now in the womb, where before the child is even born, they fix the problem. I say all that to say this. The true statistics about a mother's life being in jeopardy, preeclampsia, whatever, we know those cases long before they ever happen, and the numbers are so infinitely small that realistically is not a situation you guys are going to ever have to worry about.
I do have a question. What about specific health situations? For example, my sister 3 years ago was diagnosed with diabetes, and her risk, and I'm just being the devil's advocate, but her risk of surviving during during delivery is a lot less than that of a healthy female.
We'll get to that, and we're gonna start when we come back. We're gonna start with Andrew's comment about life. When does life begin? And I promise you, we'll address that. You guys take a break.
Hey, Justin. Burger says